The rain fell in sheets, a relentless gray curtain that smeared the world into a watercolor blur. She stood at the edge of the porch, her bare feet kissed by the cold, wet wood, staring at the spot where the earth had swallowed him whole. A year ago, the soil had been freshly turned, a wound in the ground that mirrored the one in her chest. Now, the grass had grown over it, indifferent and green, as if time could erase what she could not. Her fingers tightened around the chipped mug in her hands, the coffee long gone cold, its bitterness lingering on her tongue like an unspoken truth. She wanted to scream, to claw at the sky until it bled answers, but the silence swallowed her instead. His name was Daniel, her brother, her shadow, the one who'd laughed too loud and loved too fiercely, the one who'd promised they'd conquer the world together until the world took him first. A car, a curve, a night too dark to see the end coming. She'd been asleep when it happened, dreaming of something trivial, something she couldn't even recall now. The call had come at 3 a.m., a voice on the line slicing through her life with surgical precision. He's gone. 2 words, and the universe tilted, spilling everything she'd known into a void she couldn't reach. She'd tried to change it, hadn't she? In the days after, she'd replayed every moment, every choice. If she'd called him that night, if she'd begged him to stay home, if she'd been awake to hear the phone ring sooner, maybe the thread of fate would have held. But the past was a locked door, and her fists were bruised from pounding against it. Powerlessness crept in like damp rot, settling into her bones. She could feel it now, heavy and unyielding, pressing her down until she was nothing but a silhouette against the rain. The world kept moving. The grass grew, the rain fell, and she stood there, a stranger in her own life, watching it all unfold with a cruel indifference she couldn't comprehend. Was this what it meant to exist? To want so desperately to rewrite what couldn't be touched, to scream into a silence that didn't care? Somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought flickered, a whisper of something absurd, something about the clash between her need for meaning and a universe that offered none. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it gnawed at her, a quiet companion to her grief. The mug slipped from her hands, shattering against the porch. She didn't flinch. The sound was swallowed by the rain, just another fragment lost to the storm. She stepped forward, into the downpour, letting it soak her through. Maybe if she stood there long enough, it would wash away the weight. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, she couldn't stay still. Not yet. The rain clung to her like a second skin, dripping from her hair in rivulets that traced the lines of her face. She didn't wipe it away. She walked, barefoot and shivering, past the porch, past the grave, into the field, beyond, where the horizon blurred into a gray haze. Each step sank into the mud, a slow, deliberate surrender to something she couldn't name. The world was quiet now, save for the soft patter of water on earth. But inside her, a storm raged louder than the one overhead. Her mind churned, a tangle of thoughts that looped and knotted, pulling her deeper into herself. Daniel's laugh echoed there, sharp and bright, a sound she'd never hear again. She saw his face, those reckless green eyes, the crooked grin that dared the world to break him. It had in the end, and she hadn't been there to stop it. She hadn't even known it was coming. The thought clawed at her. I should have known. But how? There'd been no signs, no warnings, just the sudden, brutal snap of a life ending. She'd spent months chasing the why. Why him? Why then? Why not her instead? But the questions dissolved into nothing. Like smoke slipping through her fingers, she stopped walking, her breath hitching in her chest. The field stretched out endless and empty, a mirror to the hollow space inside her. What was the point of this? Of standing here? Of feeling this? She wanted to fix it, to reach back through time and yank him out of that car, to scream at him until he listened. But she couldn't. The past was a wall, the future a fog, and the present, this sodden, shivering moment, was all she had. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. A word floated up through the chaos of her mind. Absurd. She didn't know where it came from, but it fit. This was absurd. This aching need to make sense of something that refused to be understood. She'd read about it once, maybe in some dusty book she'd skimmed in college. A man named Camus, talking about a world that didn't care, about humans who kept asking it to. The universe didn't owe her Daniel. It didn't owe her anything. And yet here she was, demanding it anyway, her heart a fist banging on a door that would never open. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the mud. Cold seeped into her skin, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts fractured, spilling out in jagged pieces. If I'd been faster. If I'd been better. If I'd loved him more. Lies, all of them. She could have been everything, done everything, and still he'd be gone. That was the truth she couldn't outrun. She was powerless. Not just over his death, but over the way it kept unmaking her day after day. She pressed her hands into the earth, fingers curling into the dirt, as if she could anchor herself there. Stop the free fall. But the ground didn't hold her back. It let her sink. What did it mean then? To live in a world where nothing she did could change what mattered most? Camus had said something about that too, about facing the void, about staring into it without blinking. She didn't want to. She wanted to close her eyes, to pretend there was a reason, a purpose, a way to make it right. But the void stared back, unyielding, and she felt its weight pressing down, heavier than the rain, heavier than her grief. It whispered, "You can't fix this." And for the first time, she let herself hear it. She stayed there, kneeling in the mud, the rain washing over her like a baptism she didn't ask for. The storm outside was fading, but the one within was just beginning. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time she dragged herself back to the house, mud-streaked and trembling. Her clothes hung heavy, soaked through, but she didn't care. She stepped onto the porch, the broken mug still scattered in pieces at her feet, and froze. A figure stood there, leaning against the railing, a silhouette she hadn't expected. It was Min, her oldest friend, the one who'd known Daniel almost as well as she had. His coat was dry, his umbrella folded neatly at his side, a stark contrast to her dripping chaos. He turned, his dark eyes catching hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You look like hell," he said finally, his voice low, edged with something she couldn't place. Concern, maybe? Or exhaustion? She laughed, a brittle sound that cracked in the air. "Feel like it too." She wiped a hand across her face, smearing mud and water, and sank onto the porch steps. Min didn't move, just watched her, his silence louder than the words he wasn't saying. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone sharper than she meant it to be. He shrugged, glancing out at the field. "Figured you'd be out there again. Thought I'd check." His gaze slid back to her, steady and unyielding. "You can't keep doing this, you know, drowning yourself in it." Her chest tightened, a flare of anger licking up her spine. Drowning in what? The rain? The mud? Or the fact that he's gone and I can't? She stopped, the words choking her. She didn't need to finish. Min knew. He'd been there, at the funeral, at the hospital, holding her when she'd screamed herself hoarse. He stepped closer, crouching down to her level. You can't bring him back. No one can. You're killing yourself trying. Don't, she snapped, her voice a jagged edge. Don't tell me what I already know. I'm not stupid. I know he's gone. I know I can't change it. But knowing doesn't make it stop hurting. She glared at him, daring him to argue, to offer some platitude about time healing wounds. He didn't. Instead, he sat beside her, the porch creaking under his weight. Then what? You just sit here and let it eat you alive? That's not living. Maybe I don't want to live, she muttered, the confession slipping out before she could catch it. It hung between them, heavy and raw, and she saw his jaw tighten. Don't say that, he said quietly. Daniel wouldn't. Daniel's dead, she cut in, her voice rising. He doesn't get a say, and neither do you. You don't get it, Min. You don't feel this. This thing inside me. This nothing. It's absurd, all of it. Wanting him back, wanting it to make sense, when it never will. The world doesn't care. It just keeps going, and I'm stuck here, screaming at it. Min was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then he said, maybe it is absurd. Maybe that's the point. She blinked, caught off guard. What? You're not wrong, he went on, his voice steady. The world doesn't care. It never did. But you're still here. You're still fighting it. Even if it's just by standing in that field, yelling at the sky. That's something. That's not nothing. She stared at him, the words sinking in slow and sharp. It sounded like something Camus might have said. Rebellion, not as a victory, but as a refusal to give up. She'd never thought of it that way. She'd seen her pain as weakness, as surrender. But what if it was defiance? What if staying alive, feeling this, was its own kind of fight? Before she could respond, a car horn blared in the distance, shattering the moment. Min stood, brushing off his coat. That's my ride. Think about it, okay? You don't have to fix it. Just keep going. He hesitated, then added, call me if you need to. She didn't answer, just watched as he walked away, his figure fading into the drizzle. The porch felt emptier without him, but his words lingered, a thread she couldn't quite let go of. The world was cruel, yes, cruel in its silence, its refusal to bend. But maybe she could be crueler in her own way, by refusing to let it win. The sound of Min's car faded into the drizzle, leaving her alone again on the porch, his words circling her mind like vultures over a carcass. Keep going. As if it were that simple. As if she hadn't been clawing her way through every day since Daniel's death, dragging herself forward when all she wanted was to stop. She stood abruptly, the motion too quick, and the world tilted, a dizzying lurch that sent her stumbling against the railing. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with damp, and the faint rot of wet wood. She couldn't stay here, couldn't sit with this anymore. She turned back toward the field, her feet moving before her mind caught up. The mud sucked at her soles, colder now, the rain of fine mist that clung to her eyelashes. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to move to outrun the weight pressing down on her chest. But it followed her, relentless, a shadow stitched to her heels. Daniel's face flashed again, laughing, then still, then gone, and her legs gave out. She fell hard, knees slamming into the earth, a cry ripping from her throat. Why? She screamed, the word tearing through the silence. Why him? Why me? Why any of this? Her fists pounded the ground, mud splashing up her arms, her voice breaking into sobs that shook her whole body. The absurdity of it crashed over her like a wave, asking questions of a universe that didn't answer, begging for meaning from something that had none. Camus had been right, hadn't he? This was the void, staring back at her, and it didn't care. It never would. She curled into herself, forehead pressed to the wet earth, her breath hitching as the grief surged higher, a tide she couldn't fight. She saw it all again. The call, the hospital, the coffin sinking into the ground. She'd stood there, powerless, watching it happen, unable to stop it. And now she was here, still powerless, drowning in a pain she couldn't fix. Her hands clawed at the mud, nails digging in as if she could rip through time itself, pull him back. But the earth stayed solid, unyielding, and her strength bled out into the dirt. For a moment, she wanted it to end, not just the pain, but everything. To lie there until the rain buried her too, until she was nothing but another patch of grass the world would forget. The thought was seductive, a quiet promise of release. But then Min's voice cut through, unbidden. That's something. That's not nothing. Her sobs faltered, her hands stilled. Was it? Was this collapse? This breaking? A kind of rebellion? To feel this much? To hurt this deeply? And still be here? Was that defiance against the void? She lifted her head, mud streaking her face, and stared into the gray expanse. The mist swirled, indifferent, but she was still breathing. Her heart still beat, stubborn and loud in her chest. The pain didn't lessen. It burned hotter, sharper, but something shifted. She wasn't winning, not against this. But she wasn't done yet either. The absurd loomed, vast and cruel, and she met its gaze, trembling but unblinking. She pushed herself up, shaky and frail, and stood in the field, a small, defiant figure against the endless nothing. The mist hung low as she trudged back to the house, her steps slow but steady, the mud caked thick on her skin. The field stretched silent behind her, a vast, unanswering expanse that no longer felt like an enemy, just a fact, cold and unchangeable. She reached the porch, her hand brushing the railing where Min had leaned, and paused. The broken mug lay scattered still, its shards glinting faintly in the dim light. She didn't pick them up, not yet. She sank onto the steps, her body heavy with exhaustion, and let the quiet settle over her like a worn blanket. Daniel was gone. She couldn't change that. The truth of it sat in her chest, a stone she'd carried so long it had shaped her. She'd screamed at it, fought it, drowned in it, and still it remained. Implacable, absurd. Camus had called it a confrontation, the human heart against a mute universe, a clash with no victor. She'd wanted to win, to bend the world to her will, but there was no winning this, only enduring. And somehow, in that muddy field, she'd found a thread of something, not peace, not healing, but a refusal to let the void swallow her whole. She tilted her head back, the drizzle kissing her face, softer now, almost gentle. The pain hadn't left. It pulsed beneath her ribs, a companion she'd never shake. But it wasn't all she was. She was here, breathing, feeling, alive in spite of it all. That was her rebellion, wasn't it? To stand up, to keep going, even when the world offered no answers, no mercy. Not a triumph, but a quiet, stubborn act of being. The horizon glowed faintly, a sliver of light breaking through the gray. She watched it, her eyes tracing the line where earth met sky, and wondered what came next. Not an end to the grief, not a fix for the unfixable, but a life, maybe, built around it. She didn't know how, not yet, but for the first time, she didn't need to. She rose, her legs unsteady, but hers, and stepped inside, leaving the door open behind her. The rain whispered on, and she let it.